At precisely dawn, behind the guarded walls of the palace, a silence fell heavier than any public scandal. A financial alert routine at first revealed a figure so staggering it triggered an immediate lockdown of internal systems. $50 million. Gone. No press statement. No announcement. Just a quiet order from the king himself that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. This was not a bookkeeping error. This was something far more dangerous. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery came during what should have been an unremarkable internal audit, the kind designed to confirm stability rather than expose chaos. Instead, it did the opposite. Numbers that had always aligned suddenly didn't. A deficit appeared where none should exist, and as officials refreshed screens and cross-checked ledgers, the realization settled in with a kind of cold dread. This wasn't a delayed transfer or a temporary discrepancy. The money wasn't misplaced. It was missing. And within minutes, a chain reaction began that no one inside the palace had prepared for. Without explanation or warning, multiple royal accounts were frozen. Access was revoked. Systems were sealed. Phones rang unanswered as senior financial staff scrambled to understand what had triggered such an extreme response. Confusion quickly gave way to fear. This level of containment wasn't protocol for an error, it was the response reserved for something far more serious. Something that suggested exposure, vulnerability, and risk at the very core of the institution. King Charles was informed before any advisor, before any committee, before any discussion of optics or damage control. Those present later described his reaction not as anger, but as stillness. A pause heavy enough to unsettle the room. He asked no unnecessary questions. He requested no immediate explanations. He understood instinctively that whatever had happened was deliberate, and that reacting too quickly would only obscure the truth. The silence he maintained was not hesitation, it was calculation. As the news filtered through the palace's inner workings, panic took hold among senior financial staff. Decades of service suddenly felt irrelevant under the weight of suspicion. People who had never imagined themselves questioned began replaying years of decisions in their minds, wondering which ones might now look different under scrutiny. Quiet conversations replaced routine briefings. Eyes lingered too long. Trust, once assumed, began to fracture almost immediately. Whispers spread fast, though never aloud. This didn't feel like an external breach. There were no alarms, no cyber alerts, no forced entries in the data. The systems hadn't been attacked, they'd been accessed. Properly. Authorized. Cleanly. That realization changed everything. Because it suggested the loss wasn't the result of intrusion but familiarity. Someone knew where to look, how to move funds without drawing attention, and how to do it in a way that blended seamlessly into years of financial history. And as the first patterns were quietly reviewed, an unsettling possibility emerged. The disappearance didn't stand alone. It echoed decisions made long ago, financial paths chosen and never revisited, compromises buried under the assumption that no one would ever look back closely enough to connect them. But as panic spread behind closed doors, the king made a decision that would quietly place the entire royal household under suspicion. There was no public address, no ceremonial decree. Instead, a sealed directive moved through private channels, an investigation unlike any the monarchy had faced before. Hand-picked experts. Absolute secrecy. No exemptions. King Charles understood the implications instantly. If this became public before answers were found, the damage would be irreversible. The question was no longer where the money went, but who knew it was gone. The order did not follow tradition, and that alone sent a signal through the palace. Established hierarchies were quietly bypassed, trusted intermediaries deliberately excluded. This was not a process designed for comfort or consensus. It was designed for control. By stepping outside the usual structure, the king ensured that no one could anticipate the next move, and more importantly, no one could shape the narrative before the truth surfaced. In a place governed by protocol, unpredictability became the most powerful tool. An independent forensic team was assembled with surgical precision. Their credentials were unquestionable, their loyalty irrelevant. They were chosen precisely because they owed the palace nothing. Their mandate was narrow, but absolute. Follow the money, document every deviation, and speak only to the king. No committees. No shared briefings. The fewer people who knew the scope of the investigation, the safer the truth remained, at least for now. Orders followed swiftly, and they were unmistakable. Total discretion. No paper trails. No internal emails. No calendar entries that could later be scrutinized or leaked. Conversations were to happen in person or not at all. Even seasoned advisors felt unsettled by the severity of the silence. This wasn't damage control. It was containment. And containment implied that the threat wasn't hypothetical, it was active. As word of the investigation spread quietly through inner circles, fractures began to show. Advisors were divided. Not over whether action was necessary, but over how far the king was willing to go. Some urged restraint, warning that an aggressive inquiry could expose uncomfortable truths best left untouched. Others believed the opposite, that hesitation would only deepen the wound. The debate was tense, unresolved, and deliberately kept from the public eye, yet it reshaped alliances almost overnight. The first signs of resistance surfaced subtly, questions framed as concerns, delays masked as caution. Long-serving officials bristled at the idea of being examined by outsiders. Loyalty, once their strongest shield, now felt dangerously thin. Every request for access was interpreted as an accusation. Every pause felt like judgment. The institution had not yet been confronted, but it was already reacting. And beneath it all, a quieter emotion spread: fear. Not panic, not outrage, but something colder. Those with access to royal finances began to understand the implications. This investigation wasn't looking for a convenient explanation. It was looking for accountability. And accountability, in a system built on discretion and trust, threatened to upend more than reputations. It threatened stability itself. The palace continued its routines, outwardly unchanged. But the atmosphere had shifted. Smiles felt measured. Conversations felt incomplete. Everyone sensed that something irreversible had been set in motion, even if no one could yet see where it would end. And as the investigation quietly began, early findings pointed toward a timeline that raised even more disturbing questions. What investigators expected to find were mistakes, misfiled transfers, delayed reconciliations, clerical oversights. What they found instead was nothing. No records, no authorizations, no digital fingerprints. $50 million had vanished without triggering a single safeguard. That kind of disappearance doesn't happen by accident. It happens only when someone knows exactly how the system works. The absence was immediate and unnerving. Transaction logs that should have formed a clear trail simply stopped. Not corrupted. Not incomplete. Removed. Timestamps that once anchored decisions in place had been subtly altered, shifted just enough to blur sequence without raising alarms. It was a manipulation so precise it suggested planning, patience, and access at the highest level. Investigators began to understand that they weren't chasing a loss, they were confronting a design. As systems were cross-checked, the pattern deepened. Backup archives mirrored the same emptiness, as though deletion had rippled backward and forward through time. Safeguards meant to flag unusual movement had been overridden from within. Not disabled crudely, but redirected. Thresholds were raised quietly. Alerts were softened. Controls were left intact just long enough to appear functional. The architecture hadn't failed. It had been persuaded. With each discovery, the room grew quieter. This wasn't the work of a lone actor making a desperate move. It carried the signature of familiarity, someone who understood not only the software, but the habits of those who used it. Someone who knew when audits occurred, how reviews were conducted, and which approvals were rarely questioned. The system had been exploited precisely because it was trusted. Investigators compared timelines across departments and found synchronization where there should have been randomness. Access logs aligned across separate offices. Adjustments were mirrored by complementary changes elsewhere. It suggested coordination, not coincidence. The idea that multiple people were involved was no longer speculative. It was becoming unavoidable. No single person could have sustained this level of concealment alone without drawing attention. Silence, it seemed, had been shared. The emotional weight of that realization settled heavily. Protocols designed to protect the crown had been turned inward, weaponized against accountability. Every rule followed had become a shield for wrongdoing. Investigators felt the gravity of what this implied not just for the missing funds, but for the integrity of the institution itself. If safeguards could be bent so cleanly, then trust had been misused long before the money disappeared. As the analysis continued, a theory took shape, darker and more complex than any initial fear. This was not a reaction to opportunity, it was preparation. The groundwork had been laid over time, small adjustments accumulating without scrutiny. Each change made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a corridor through which vast sums could pass unseen. The system had been taught not to look. By the end of the review, the question had shifted again. It was no longer about how the money vanished, or even when. It was about permission explicit or implied, and the authority that allowed invisibility to become routine. The investigation was peeling back layers, and beneath them lay not chaos, but order. Deliberate, disciplined, and dangerously familiar. And with every erased record, attention began shifting toward those who had the authority to make such changes invisible. Within days, the investigation narrowed its focus not on outsiders, but on the inner sanctum of palace power. Trusted aides, senior financial stewards, individuals who had served the crown for decades. Loyalty, once unquestioned, was now a liability. Every private meeting, every signature, every decision from years past was suddenly under the microscope. The questioning began quietly, almost respectfully, but the effect was seismic. Senior aides were summoned one by one into rooms where conversations had always felt safe. Doors closed. Records were placed on tables. Timelines were recited with unnerving precision. No accusations were made outright, yet every pause carried implication. The unspoken message was clear: tenure no longer guaranteed protection. History no longer shielded anyone from scrutiny. Long-serving officials, once composed and confident, began to show the strain. Sleeplessness crept into their voices. Hands lingered too long on documents as if searching for reassurance that the past would still make sense under this new light. These were people who had built their identities around service, around discretion, around being unseen. Now, invisibility itself felt like guilt. The emotional cost of suspicion settled in slowly, then all at once. As the investigation progressed, internal power dynamics began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Advisors who once spoke freely chose their words carefully. Some withdrew, others overcompensated. Alliances that had taken years to form fractured in days. Trust eroded not because guilt had been proven, but because certainty had been removed. In a system built on mutual confidence, doubt was corrosive. Private arguments erupted behind closed doors, raw and unresolved. Who should be held accountable for decisions made collectively? Where did responsibility end when actions were approved by tradition rather than oversight? Some insisted the investigation was overreaching, threatening to unravel the very structure that kept the monarchy stable. Others argued that stability built on silence was already compromised. The divide wasn't ideological, it was personal. Everyone had something to lose. The emotional fallout rippled outward. Staff who had dedicated their lives to the institution felt blindsided, betrayed not only by the possibility of misconduct, but by the realization that loyalty may have been misused. Quiet confidence gave way to anger, then to grief. If trust had been exploited, then devotion itself had become collateral damage. The palace felt smaller, heavier, less certain of its own moral footing. Gradually, an uncomfortable truth began to surface. Loyalty, revered and rewarded for generations, may have created the perfect cover. Decisions went unquestioned because they came from familiar hands. Approvals passed smoothly because they always had. The system didn't just allow misconduct, it insulated it. What had once been the monarchy's greatest strength now looked dangerously close to its greatest vulnerability. As investigators connected names to actions and actions to moments long assumed settled, the past refused to stay buried. The inner circle was no longer a place of safety. It was a fault line. And the deeper the inquiry went, the clearer it became that the answers would not be found in the present alone, But as investigators dug deeper, the timeline began to intersect with moments the palace had long tried to forget. The missing funds didn't vanish overnight. They drained away gradually, aligned with pivotal moments in recent royal history renovations, legal settlements, quiet payouts never acknowledged publicly. What once seemed unrelated now formed a pattern. And that pattern suggested the money wasn't stolen impulsively, it was redirected deliberately. Over time, under the cover of legitimacy. As investigators overlaid financial data with the monarchy's recent milestones, uncomfortable connections began to surface. Periods of intense spending coincided too neatly with moments the palace had described as necessary, unavoidable, even virtuous. Renovations justified as preservation. Settlements framed as discretion. Payments explained as administrative closure. Each decision had been defended convincingly in isolation. Together, they painted a story no one had intended to tell. Financial choices once praised for their decisiveness were suddenly re-examined with fresh eyes. Transfers that had passed without debate now appeared unusually timed. Budgets approved without resistance raised questions no one had thought to ask before. The language used at the time, stability, continuity, duty, returned with a sharper edge. It no longer soothed, it obscured. What had felt like stewardship began to resemble something closer to orchestration. Old disagreements resurfaced quietly at first, then with force. Advisors remembered moments when concerns were raised and swiftly dismissed, when caution was framed as disloyalty, when pressing too hard was seen as disruption rather than diligence. Those memories, once suppressed in the interest of unity, now carried weight. Conversations that had ended years ago resumed without warning, heavy with the knowledge that restraint might have allowed something irreversible to grow. As the timeline stretched backward, so did the emotional toll. Advisors who had accepted compromises for the greater good began to question what that good had truly served. Decisions made to protect the institution now felt complicit in weakening it. The weight of those choices returned unexpectedly, accompanied by regret and quiet anger. It wasn't just money that had been redirected. Responsibility had been deferred. Accountability had been postponed. The realization settled slowly but firmly. The truth implicated more than finances. It reached into judgment, governance, and the culture that prized smooth resolution over difficult confrontation. The system had rewarded silence, and silence had allowed patterns to form undisturbed. What had been rationalized as necessity now demanded explanation. The past, long considered settled, was asserting itself with unforgiving clarity. As investigators followed the trail further back, the sense of inevitability grew. This wasn't about one transaction or one moment of weakness. It was about a series of choices, each small enough to justify, each reasonable enough to defend, accumulating into something no one could deny. The story had been unfolding for years, hidden in plain sight, protected by tradition and the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. And just as the scope widened, a confidential report surfaced, one never meant to be reopened. Years ago, a financial review flagged irregularities, but the report was quietly shelved. Labeled inconclusive, forgotten by design. Now, resurfacing under forensic scrutiny, it told a very different story. Warnings were issued, concerns were raised, and someone made sure nothing came of them. The discovery landed with a dull, unsettling weight. Buried deep in archived files, the audit had not been lost, it had been placed exactly where no one would think to look. Its language was cautious, almost restrained, but the implications were unmistakable. Numbers that failed to reconcile. Patterns that repeated without explanation. Recommendations that asked for further review and were met with silence. The report hadn't been wrong. It had been inconvenient. As investigators read line by line, a sense of recognition set in. The same anomalies they were uncovering now had been visible then. Just earlier, quieter, easier to dismiss. Red flags were not missed. They were acknowledged and set aside. Notes in the margins suggested follow-ups that never occurred. Requests for clarification that went unanswered. The record showed not negligence, but choice. The question shifted almost immediately from oversight to intent. Who had the authority to shelve a review of this magnitude? Who decided that inconclusive was sufficient to end the conversation? Emails referenced meetings that were never documented. Approvals appeared without context. The trail didn't end, it dissolved. And in that dissolution lay the unmistakable shape of protection. The emotional reaction among investigators was sharp and conflicted. There was vindication in knowing the truth had been seen before, and anger in realizing it had been ignored. Staff who had trusted the system felt a deep sense of betrayal, not only by individuals, but by the culture that allowed warnings to be neutralized through delay. The weight of that realization pressed heavily. This wasn't a sudden failure. It was a prolonged one. When King Charles was briefed on the report's contents, the impact was profound. This was no longer about a missing sum or a technical breach. It was about an institution that had chosen quiet over clarity. He confronted the uncomfortable reality that leadership, past and present, had permitted risk to grow unchecked. The gravity of that responsibility settled in, not as accusation, but as reckoning. The investigation's purpose changed in that moment. It was no longer enough to trace transactions or identify discrepancies. The focus turned inward, toward decision-making itself. Who had intervened to stop further inquiry? Who had benefited from delay? And who had believed that time would erase the need for answers? The silence that followed the original report was no longer passive, it was active, sustained, and deeply consequential. As the implications spread through the palace, defenses hardened. Old explanations were revisited and found wanting. Justifications once accepted without challenge now sounded hollow. The past was asserting itself, demanding accountability not just for what happened, but for what was prevented from happening. The buried report had become a mirror, reflecting years of avoided responsibility back at those who had wielded it. At that moment, the investigation crossed a point of no return, because the silence itself had become evidence. Trust collapsed quickly once the truth began surfacing. Advisors took sides. Conversations turned guarded. Meetings ended abruptly. The palace was no longer unified, it was divided by fear, guilt, and survival. King Charles found himself not only investigating a financial crime, but managing a monarchy on the brink of internal fracture. The tension was immediate and unmistakable. Senior officials who once moved in quiet alignment now spoke past one another, their words edged with defensiveness. Long-standing relationships strained under the weight of implication. Some pushed for distance, eager to separate their names from decisions that were suddenly radioactive. Others clung to shared responsibility, arguing that collective action meant collective protection. The result was paralysis. Nothing moved without friction. Advisors began distancing themselves from past approvals with alarming speed. Statements were reworded. Memories softened. Responsibility blurred. Decisions that had once been proudly defended were now described as procedural, inherited, unavoidable. The shift was not subtle. It was survival instinct made visible. Each effort to step back only heightened suspicion, reinforcing the sense that everyone was calculating how much blame might land where. Behind closed doors, emotional confrontations erupted. Voices rose. Accusations slipped through carefully chosen language. Years of restrained frustration surfaced all at once. Some felt betrayed by colleagues they had trusted implicitly. Others felt cornered by an investigation they believed had lost perspective. The palace, a place built on restraint and decorum, echoed with conflict it was never designed to absorb. As the internal struggle intensified, a new fear took hold: the possibility of leaks. Every tense exchange, every sudden meeting, every sealed document carried the risk of exposure. Advisors worried less about the truth and more about timing. If the public learned of the infighting before the investigation concluded, the damage would be uncontrollable. Secrecy, once a shield, now felt fragile, as though it could shatter under pressure. King Charles was forced into a role he had not anticipated. There was no space left for quiet consensus building or gentle persuasion. He became an enforcer of boundaries, a final authority rather than a unifying presence. Decisions were made firmly, sometimes abruptly. Lines were drawn. Silence was demanded where debate once thrived. It was a transformation that carried its own cost, altering how power was felt within the institution. The emotional toll of this shift was profound. Those who had believed in continuity now confronted instability. Those who had relied on tradition found themselves navigating uncertainty. The investigation was no longer confined to numbers and reports. It had become a reckoning with identity, with trust, with the fragility of a system that depended on harmony to function. And beneath every argument, every denial, every attempt at control, loomed the awareness that some consequences could not be undone. Relationships damaged in this moment would not return to what they were. Authority, once questioned, would never feel the same. The palace was changing from the inside out, and no one could stop it. And as pressure mounted internally, the outside world began sensing that something was deeply wrong. The palace shifted into containment mode. Legal teams mobilized. Communication strategies were drafted but never finalized. Because no one knew how much worse the truth could get. $50 million was only the beginning. The real danger was what its disappearance revealed about power, secrecy, and control at the highest level. Emergency planning unfolded with an urgency usually reserved for constitutional crises. Advisors who had spent careers refining ceremonial language now argued over legal exposure and reputational survival. Every scenario was mapped, then revised, then quietly abandoned when new information surfaced. The pace was relentless. Plans were built on assumptions that no longer held, and each revision carried the same uneasy question: how much of this could still be contained? Behind the scenes, legal implications were assessed with ruthless precision. Liability, responsibility, precedent. Each word carried weight. The investigation's findings threatened not only individuals but the architecture that had protected them. Counsel warned that even partial disclosure could invite scrutiny far beyond the palace gates. Others countered that silence, once protective, now looked like admission. The line between strategy and surrender blurred with every closed-door briefing. Advisors split again, this time over disclosure versus silence. One camp argued that controlled transparency could preserve credibility, that owning the narrative might limit the damage. The other insisted that revelation would only deepen the wound, exposing vulnerabilities that could never be sealed again. The debate wasn't theoretical. It was urgent. Every hour without a decision increased the risk of leaks, speculation, and public suspicion hardening into belief. Fear settled heavily over discussions of credibility. The monarchy's authority rested on trust built slowly over generations. To fracture that trust now would not be a temporary setback, it would be a recalibration of how power itself was perceived. Advisors spoke in measured tones, but the anxiety was unmistakable. This was no longer about a missing sum. It was about whether the institution could withstand the truth without losing its moral footing. King Charles listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was deliberate. He weighed transparency against tradition, accountability against continuity. Every option carried cost. Full disclosure risked unraveling long-held assumptions. Partial disclosure risked appearing evasive. Silence risked everything. The burden of that choice narrowed to a single reality. Leadership now required exposure, not concealment. As the days passed, the sense of inevitability grew. Information has momentum. Once set in motion, it resists containment. Advisors could feel it pressing outward, testing defenses. The palace could delay, but not indefinitely. Each effort to control the narrative only confirmed that there was something to control. The walls were closing in, not from the outside, but from the accumulation of truth inside them. The investigation reached its final phase with a clarity that cut through uncertainty. The question was no longer whether exposure would happen, but how it would reshape everything that followed. What began as a financial anomaly had become a reckoning with governance, trust, and consequence, and there would be no return to the way things were. And as the walls closed in, the investigation delivered one final conclusion, one that would redefine everything. The investigation did not conclude with a neat explanation or a single figure to blame. It ended with something far more unsettling, a realization that the machinery of the monarchy itself had allowed the damage to happen. Funds had not disappeared because rules were unclear or systems were fragile, but because authority had gone unchallenged for too long. When the final report crossed King Charles's desk, it did not read like a conclusion. It read like an indictment of complacency, of quiet permissions granted over years. and of warnings that had been softened until they no longer sounded like warnings at all. What unsettled him most was not the numbers, but what they represented. Each missing sum pointed back to decisions made in silence, approvals given without scrutiny, and a culture that trusted lineage more than oversight. Responsibility no longer belonged to one individual, it expanded outward, implicating advisors, traditions, and even the Crown's own reluctance to question itself. The findings reframed the entire scandal, shifting the narrative from betrayal by a few to failure by many, and placing the weight of that realization squarely on the king's shoulders. Privately, the toll was visible. Leadership, once defined by continuity and restraint, now demanded confrontation. Charles was forced to reckon with the cost of maintaining harmony at the expense of truth. Each closed-door briefing carried the same underlying tension: reveal too much and risk destabilizing the institution, or reveal too little and confirm every suspicion already forming in the public mind. The emotional strain was not just political, it was deeply personal, tied to legacy, to memory, and to the fear of being remembered as the monarch who chose silence when honesty was required. Secrecy, once the monarchy's greatest shield, had become its most dangerous liability. The longer details remained buried, the louder the questions grew. Accountability promised pain headlines, backlash, and internal fractures, but denial promised something worse: erosion. Trust, once lost, does not return quietly. It fractures slowly, invisibly, until one day the structure it supports can no longer stand. And Charles knew that the credibility of the crown now hung in that fragile space between confession and concealment. The future, still unwritten, began to divide into two stark paths. One led toward transparency, reform, and the uncomfortable work of proving that tradition could coexist with truth. The other led toward deflection, familiar defenses, and the hope that time would dull public memory. Neither path offered safety. One threatened upheaval, the other threatened irrelevance. The choice was not about optics anymore, it was about survival. As the investigation formally closed, its paperwork filed and statements drafted, the deeper reckoning refused to settle. What had been exposed could not be unseen. The monarchy stood on the edge of a defining moment, its next steps poised to shape not just public perception, but its own conscience. And the question lingered, unanswered and unavoidable. When power is finally confronted with its own reflection, will it choose to change or simply learn how to hide better? Because while the investigation may have closed on paper, its consequences were only just beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.